Hello and good afternoon to all of you. Warm welcome to this book launch organized by the Lithuanian Embassy in the United Kingdom. And my name is Pavel Horák. I shall be your host today, and I'm a junior researcher at the Institute of Ethnology and Czech Academy of Sciences in Prague, and a visiting researcher at the Cambridge University. Today, we are here to listen to Dr. Francis Young, featuring his new book, Pagans in the Early Modern Baltic, 16th, 17th century ethnographic accounts. And, this event is, as I stressed, is organized by the Lithuanian Embassy in the United Kingdom, and we've been promised that the event will be introduced by His Excellency, the Ambassador of Lithuania. However, His Excellency cannot be with us at the moment, but he will be sending his regards via a short video, which we will now present you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Embassy of Lithuania in London. First of all, I would like to sincerely thank the author, Dr. Francis Young, for his long-standing scholarly and personal interest in the Lithuanian history, and for his efforts to disseminate the findings of his research in the Baltic paganism worldwide. It's noteworthy that the book, Pagans in the Early Modern Baltic, is the first translation into English of the key Latin texts about the religion, culture, and language of the Balts, when paganism was still a living reality in the Baltic region. Thus, in this sense, could it be considered or expected to be a beginning for the wider interest and study of Baltic history in the English-speaking world? I hope that the vibrant scholarly discussion among our honorable guests from the Lithuanian, Latvian, and British academia will touch upon not only the book itself, but also on the further perspective of the Baltic history and culture studies in general. Needless to say, it is our pleasure to host the launch of the book at the Lithuanian Embassy, and I very much hope that the author, Dr. Francis Young, will present us more likewise opportunities in the future. So with all this short introduction, I wish you very inspiring discussion and have a good time today at the Embassy here in this wonderful summerly morning in London. Thank you very much.
Thank you, His Excellency. Well, just before we start, I'll briefly introduce Francis and his work. Then I'll give floor to Francis. He will talk about his book about 20 minutes. Then after that, there will be a short replies by Professor Ališauskas and then by Dr. Ķencis. Then I'll reply a bit again, and then as well, and then we'll open the floor to Q&A, and we should be finishing in say 53 minutes. So Francis' work, or Dr. Young's work. Dr. Young, or Francis, as I'll be calling him throughout this book launch, he's a I would say really well-renowned historian and folklorist based here in the UK. He specializes in the history of religion and history of belief, magic, folklore, saints, history of church, and foremost, he authored or co-authored more than 18 books. I won't definitely enumerate all of them, but just for you to have a kind of glimpse, taking just those books published this year in 2022. So one was Magic in Merlin's Realm, a history of occult politics in Britain, which was published by Cambridge University Press, and which discusses the overlaps between the occult, esoteric, and politics throughout last several centuries. And in January this year, another book, Witchcraft and the Modern Roman Catholic Church, was published also by Cambridge University Press. Well, today we'll be witnessing the book launch of these Pagans in the Early Modern Baltic, 16th and 17th century ethnographic accounts of Baltic paganism, which was published by ARC Humanities Press just a month ago, basically. And as His Excellency has already noted, the book is really crucial for the English-speaking audience worldwide, as it provides English translation of the key Latin text, which has not appeared yet or beforehand in English. So I'm really excited, because I really think that this is really a kind of groundbreaking work, and the book can serve as a basis for a future of further discussion. Well, I would now hand over the floor to Francis, so he could introduce the book himself, and then we will go to the replies and then to the Q&A. So please, Francis, the floor is yours.
Pavel, thank you so much for that kind introduction. And I'm very grateful and want to express my thanks to His Excellency Ambassador Norkus, the staff of the Lithuanian Embassy, for their generosity in hosting this online event. And I'm also very grateful to all the participants who are going to be speaking today and replying about the book. I'm grateful to them for agreeing to have a read and a look at this book. But I want to say a little bit about what the book is and why I wrote it. And the main reason really is because these texts describing Baltic religion have not previously been accessible within the English-speaking world. And so what I do in the book is to present 10 texts, which are all in the Latin language, and I've translated them into English. They've previously been available in other languages. They've all been translated into Lithuanian, some of them into German and Polish and Russian, but not previously into English. And I believe that there is a case to be made that it's very important for the English-speaking world to have access to the key texts about Baltic religion. It's something which allows us to understand the surviving traces of pagan religion in late medieval and early modern Europe, a period when such traces had not yet entirely disappeared. And it's also something that allows us to understand the development of European responses to indigenous religion in general. And after 1492, that's something that becomes an issue of global importance. How do Christians respond to the religion of those who have never previously had contact with Christianity or the great monotheistic religions? And so there's a sense in which the study of Baltic religions, or writing about Baltic religions, prepares the ground for that later encounter. So I would argue that this is a body of texts whose importance extends beyond the Baltic. In fact, it extends beyond East Central Europe. But at the same time, we have to be mindful of who it was who wrote these texts. All of the authors were at least nominally Christians, and they were commenting on Baltic pagans who themselves left no record of their own beliefs in their own words. At the time that these texts were written, all of the texts date from between 1458 is the earliest and the latest was published in 1581. But at the time of these texts being written, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was in search of its own place in the narrative of European history. And central to that was the portrayal of Lithuanians as the descendant of Romans. And that was a narrative project that was advanced by both Lithuanians and Poles after the Cravo Union in 1385. And this changed the discourse on Baltic religion, a discourse that had previously been dominated by hostile crusaders. And so we have a number of German authors, particularly in the Middle Ages, who write about Baltic religion in a very hostile and a very derogatory way. But this changes somewhat after the Cravo Union, because Lithuanian religion at this point is seen not simply as a barbaric religion of terrible idolaters, as the Crusaders had portrayed it, but as the degenerated remains of what was believed to have been Roman religion. And this is because the Lithuanians at this time are portraying themselves as the descendants of Romans, and their religion naturally would therefore be expected to be a form of Roman religion. And that's significant because Roman and Greek religion, while pagan, were culturally valued within the Renaissance and within late medieval and early modern society. So suddenly these pagans have been catapulted from a position of complete being despised to a position of being considered in some ways the heirs to this tradition of Greece and Rome. But having said that, there were significant variations in the ways in which Baltic religion were portrayed. And these are evident in the texts that are included in the edition. For example, Johann Stuhler, who called himself Erasmus Stella in Latin, who was a German Prussian, writes in a very derogatory way about Baltic religion, portraying the Prussians, the native Prussians, as little better than animals. And that's clearly a portrayal which harks back to those earlier medieval traditions. Prussian, Latvian, and Estonian religion, it's important to remember, were treated very differently in the colonial context of Prussia, dominated by German-speaking settler colonialists, or indeed Livonia, where the Latvians and Estonians were dominated by Germans and Danes. And that was very different compared to the political situation of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, where Lithuanian nobles who were directly descended from pagan forebears wielded great power, not only in Lithuania, but also within the Commonwealth as a whole. But these political and religious motives for portraying Baltic religion in particular ways were also accompanied by the development of genuine humanist curiosity. And that's in contrast to most medieval commentators on the Baltic. This is a historiographical revolution, a transformation in the way that history was written, which didn't just happen in East Central Europe, but happened throughout the continent, where there was a move towards expressing and exploring curiosity in human nature itself. Why do humans in their natural state do what they do? And this is something which becomes increasingly divorced from theological considerations, although they're always there in the background, and can be connected to developments such as the Turkish conquest of Constantinople and the expansion of the Mongols and Tartars in Eurasia, where these peoples with little contact with the great European monotheisms, all belonging to competing religions, but of obscure ethnic origin, are impinging on the edge of Europe and demand to be understood. So the exploration of the Lithuanians, the Livonians, the Prussians is something which really fits into that broader context of humanist curiosity about the human family. And of course, that curiosity will soon be taken to the global stage in the exploration and encounter with indigenous peoples in the New World. Now, it's impossible for me to avoid the question of whether there really were pagans in the early modern Baltic. The sources that are presented in the book are paradoxical in this regard. They portray pagans as simultaneously a feature of the present, but also something that belongs in the past. And this needs to be seen as a rhetorical strategy by the writers concerned. On the one hand, portraying paganism as a thing of the past establishes a form of Christian supremacy, which clearly is important within the context of the development of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as a Christian state. But on the other hand, the portrayal of paganism as a real and present reality is a way of encouraging Christians within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth to be awake to the danger of sliding back into pagan practices or pagan ways. The Reformation and then the Counter-Reformation in the Baltic region created a complex and confused at times religious picture, especially in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, a state that was officially Catholic, that was in union with another very much Catholic state in Poland. In practice, however, demographically, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was mostly Orthodox, with most of its population being Orthodox believers. And in practice, for much of the period, or certainly for the second half of the 16th century, the leading figures who governed the Grand Duchy were Protestants. And in addition to that complex picture, there were perhaps some surviving pagans. And so the discourse about and against paganism becomes a tool used by both the reformers and the counter-reformers. For example, the reformers see the persistence or alleged persistence of paganism in the Grand Duchy as a judgment against Catholicism and indeed against Orthodoxy. The fact that the Catholic and Orthodox clergy have allowed pagans to survive in remote rural areas shows that they themselves are not truly committed to the gospel. In Protestant eyes, they're not truly Christians at all. And therefore, the existence of paganism becomes a tool of Reformation polemic to show that Reformation is needed. And in the book, there are examples of texts written by both Lutheran and Calvinist writers. An example of a Lutheran writer would be Martynas Mažvydas, the author of the First Lithuanian Catechism, and the book includes an English translation of the preface, the Latin preface, to his Lithuanian book. And an example of a Calvinist author would be Jan Lasicki, the Polish author who traveled through and visited Samogitia in the 1550s and is writing there about Samogitian pagan religion. But in fact, a significant portion of his book on the gods of the Samogitians is dedicated to attacks on the Orthodox, because clearly what he encounters in Samogitia is a mixed community of Orthodox, nominal Catholics, and apparent pagans. But it's also a strategy that can be used by the counter-reformers, the Catholic clergy who are coming in after the Reformation has already impinged on Lithuania, in order to make their case that in fact the Protestant Reformation has been a bad thing and has held back the cause of the conversion of Lithuania. And in fact, one of the key arguments that is made by the counter-reformers, particularly the Jesuits, is that the Calvinists and the Lutherans have only succeeded in sowing confusion and division. And within that confusion and division, where people no longer know what the Christian faith is, paganism has been able to creep back, and there is the presence of recrudescent paganism in the countryside. And therefore, you find figures who are in fact coming from a counter-Reformation perspective, arguing that the continuing existence of paganism is a judgment against the Protestants for failing to wipe it out. And that's something which actually goes back to before the Reformation, when you find Jogaila and his cultural coterie arguing that in fact the Crusaders have only held back the cause of Christianization. At the Council of Constance, Jogaila's representatives advanced the case that in fact Lithuania should be controlling Samogitia, for example, because the Crusaders have failed to bring about the Christian faith. All they've done is bring about destruction and the sword. And so that is taken forward into the Reformation era, when the now Lutheran Prussians, German Prussians that is to say, are portrayed as not being really advocates of the gospel at all. Now, the importance of the Reformation to the rise, or indeed the origins of literature in Lithuanian, I think need to be stated. Because as I've mentioned, one of the texts that is translated in this volume is the Latin preface to Mažvydas' Catechism. That is the first book to be printed in the Lithuanian language. And it's almost a paradox of the Reformation in Lithuania, that the reformers are determined to stamp out what traces remain of paganism. And yet at the same time, the fact that they are finding a way to express themselves in the Lithuanian language means that they need to engage with Lithuanian culture. And engaging with Lithuanian culture means engaging with Lithuanian religion. And this is something which happens throughout the Reformation movement, that whilst on the one hand, the reformers are very hostile to folk religion, very hostile to popular practices, at the same time, they end up engaging very closely with those practices because they've got to find a way to express themselves. We see the same thing in the Lutheran Reformation in Germany. We see the same thing in the English Reformation as well. The reformers suddenly become very interested in what we might call the beginnings of the recording of folklore. And in Lithuania, that takes the form of engaging with what the Lithuanians believe. So these texts, therefore, almost become by accident these extraordinary and important records of what people believed on the ground of popular belief. And yet they were, in many cases, written by people who wanted to stamp out those beliefs. And a good example of that would be on the Sacrifices of the Old Prussians by Malecki, father and son, these two printers working in Königsberg, who are determined to record the practices of the Sudovians and the pagan Prussians as a way of informing preachers and ministers who are to be sent into these areas of Prussia and Lithuania Minor, who may well be encountering vestigial pagans and therefore need to understand their practices. But as I've already hinted at, there is an ongoing debate about the true extent to which Lithuanian or Prussian or indeed Livonian beliefs after 1387, the date of the official conversion of Lithuania, can truly be considered pagan, and whether that's a word that we can legitimately use here. And something that I argue in the introduction to the book is that comparisons with other cultures can help us to understand the phenomenon of religious syncretism in officially Christian but very poorly catechized societies. What we know about Lithuania and Samogitia after 1387 is that the work of catechization, of informing people and teaching people about the Christian faith, is very imperfect. And it is something which continues to be incomplete, continues to be a source of anxiety for the religious authorities well into the 18th century, indeed into the late 18th century, when missions are still taking place into the countryside and performative acts like the cutting down of sacred trees are still taking place. But was Lithuania in the 16th century a pagan society or a society with pagan elements? Or was it a Christian society where certain forms of syncretism continued to exist? And that's a debate which will continue. I'm not sure whether we have sources that are sufficient to resolve that question. But certainly there were strong elements of the pagan heritage still present in Lithuanian popular religion. Well, the purpose of Pagans in the early modern Baltic is to present the most important Latin texts about pre-Christian Baltic religion and to trace the development of a humanist textual tradition that discussed those elements of paganism. But I also want to say a little before I finish about what the book doesn't do. And this, I hope, will stimulate some discussion. The book is just a start for the study of Baltic religion in the English-speaking world, because its main focus is on the representation of pagan religion. It doesn't attempt a historical reconstruction of the exact nature of what that religion really was. And reconstructionist approaches to Baltic religion in the Baltic states have traditionally drawn on folklore that was collected in the 19th and 20th centuries, and they've made strong use of comparative mythology. And the validity and usefulness of those approaches continues to be debated, of course. But archaeology is also adding increasingly to our understanding of the material context of Baltic religion. And archaeology uniquely perhaps gives an opportunity for Baltic pagans of the Middle Ages to speak with their own voice rather than with the interpretation of someone else. So the pre-Christian religious heritage of the Baltic peoples is of great significance, clearly, to many people in the Baltic states, and also in the Lithuanian and Latvian diasporas throughout the world, serving as a source of cultural and religious inspiration. And therefore, I am hopeful that this volume will help particularly English speakers or those who are most confident in the English language to have an opportunity to connect with those traditions, that history. And so I'm very grateful to everyone here once again for being part of this discussion. And I'll hand back to you now, Pavel, to open that discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francis. And I do think it will become a kind of basis or a source book or source text or source volume where other scholars would come to consult this fascinating body of texts portraying the pre-Christian, contemporary Christian/pagan society of the Baltic area. Well, without further ado, I will now hand over the word to Professor Ališauskas from the Department of Classical Philology, Faculty of Philology, Vilnius University, who is having the first reply. Please, Professor Ališauskas, the floor is yours.
Hello to everyone. Thank you, Francis, for your really very interesting presentation. I also have a big pleasure at your introduction to the book, and I think it will be for some time at least the main source of information about status of knowledge about Baltic religions. And you touch some very important points, I think, in your presentation now. It's I suppose it's very important to make difference to approaches from different authors, from different confessions to this so-called old pre-Christian beliefs or religions. Also, we must understand the difference of narratives, the difference of the different approaches from literary point of view. And also, what is very important too, to understand that sources are based, or these texts are based on very different sources. For example, the text of Dlugoš or Bonacorsi are based, maybe, it's of course a hypothesis, but enough serious that it was based on information received from Lithuanian nobility who studied in Krakow University, or from also from persons of the king, the persons of the court of King of Poland and Grand Duke Lithuania in Krakow, who were descended from Lithuania. So on another side, information of Lasicki is received from Jakub Laskowski, who was important agent in land reform in Samogitia mainly, and who read contacts with peasantry. It was not how to say, just erudition or literary investigations, but it was also based on, let's say, based on real experiences of this person. And I don't know, I am not sure that we can say that Lasicki didn't know Lithuanian language. I think he knew some Lithuanian, and the problem is these mistakes and unreadable some sentences in book of Lasicki. It's not only the problem that Lasicki didn't know Lithuanian language, but also the printers, printing house or publishing house who was not able to prepare text in good quality. We must remember that the book was published long after death of Lasicki. So, and what we can say, for me, it's also, okay, it's time to finish, I see. I would like only stress only one very important moment for me also. Your presentation, we cannot look at these beliefs of state, of populations such as Prussians, Latvians, Livonians, Lithuanians, Samogitians. They cannot see this like statical object. Usually there are a big enthusiasm to reconstruct some kind of Platonic ideal religion, ideal Lithuanian or Baltic even religion, and we don't remember that in this case we forget in this case that we have deal with different beliefs and very different religions, and I am very happy of this, that Francis speaks about religions, not religion, in this Baltic region. Also, we must remember a kind of syncretisms in this pagan field. I mean that there is influences from Slavic religions. From another side, we have influences from Finno-Ugrian religions. So we cannot speak about something we have in very pure state. Also, I'm happy with skepticism of Francis that we can reconstruct some pre-Christian beliefs from our folklore and ethnography. Maria Gimbutas was very enthusiastic on this, and in her books Baltai, she the Balts, she wrote about this with good eloquence. But really, we have, if we have something what we have from pagan relicts, we have it for at least at best from 17th, 18th centuries, and we have had a big change in Lithuanian society, especially in peasantry, after the land reform in the middle of 16th century. This land reform changed all way of life of peasantry, and of course all these remains of older religion also changed very soon. So my some remarks. Sorry for delaying.
Thank you very much, Professor Ališauskas. I'll now hand the floor to Dr. Toms Ķencis from University of Latvia, Institute of Literature, Folklore and Art, to address his comment or his reply. So Toms, if you're ready, yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pavel. And first of all, thank you, Dr. Young, for this amazing book. And thank you, Embassy of Lithuania, for inviting me to share my thoughts on this event. Well, for those of you who will reading the book, you will see that the focal point of it is Christianization of Lithuania and this stately formation as Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And then you may wonder what it has to do with Latvian folklore and Latvian mythology, the fields I represent in discussion here. And as Dr. Young indicated, those early modern authors, they had some very particular reasons for conceptualizing Lithuania as Christian or as pagan or some mix of those two, what we could call identities. But however, the sources translated in the volume, they show that those authors drew very strict line, very strict boundary between territory of Lithuania, Grand Duchy, and Livonia, with maybe only one or two exceptions where Livonians are mentioned as doing the same practices. But otherwise, due to their agenda and the politics of the day, this boundary was quite strict. But since that, every subsequent stage of comparative mythology or comparative research of Baltic mythology and pagan religion has blurred this boundary between Grand Duchy and Livonia. Speaking then of Baltic mythology or pagan religion as a kind of system shared by predecessors of Prussians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, those pagans of modern times and medieval and earlier periods. And of course, this comparative hypothesis allowing to speak about some kind of united system has been promoted by with different agendas in different times, also depending on the author. This with I would say with the same diversity as diverse are the sources whom they refer to. And here, this comparative perspective between different Baltic territories is a fundament that makes new translation crucial for research of Latvian mythology and folklore too. And moreover, those chronicles and letters, especially Malecki, have been among historically most prominent sources in research of Latvian ancient religion so far, and most quoted and discussed. And now this English translation is a key for developing further studies and raising the language barrier for those who do not know Latin or German or also Lithuanian that had some translations. That would include also me. And providing a critical context, even more important critical context for reading those ancient texts as well. And regarding context, it was also for me one of the most interesting things was that how author again and again highlights those references to models of classical antiquity and classical authors in writings in early modern texts. Because those classical references, if you look at the research of Baltic mythology, they appear also in works of, say, 18th century enlighteners, and then in works of 19th century romanticists, in writings of national romanticists, and then in 20th century comparative philologists, and so on, continuing. And now, in a way, we can get to the core, to the source of this tradition of interpretation and framing. And even more interesting is perspective that this new English translation opens up globally, because with it there is potentially a colossal increase in scholars and students who could integrate those Baltic sources in their own research in maybe some very geographically or disciplinary distant areas, or to do something we even cannot imagine now. And at the same time, that would generate a reflexive link back to us and show our Baltic history in a new light, in new cultural contexts. Like for the examples also Dr. Young provides in the introduction, like concerning colonial histories of modern times in what then was known as East and West Indies. So I'm looking forward when it all will come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ķencis. Thanks a lot. Well, it's 1:45, so we are running a bit short on time. So I'll perhaps leave my own comments for the Q&A, and I would now perhaps give the floor back to Francis. So, Francis, you could reply to what we have heard so far by Professor Ališauskas and Dr. Ķencis.
First of all, I'm very grateful to Professor Ališauskas and Dr. Ķencis for their comments, which are very generous to the book. And I think your work is inspiring and very useful for this field. And I'm particularly delighted that Dr. Ķencis thinks that this might open up the possibility that people throughout the world might make use of this, not just in the study of Baltic religion, but also in comparative religion, in studies of completely unrelated fields that haven't previously been integrated with the research that's going on into Baltic religions. Yes, I think that all of the points that you've raised are very important. And I particularly liked, Professor Ališauskas, your rejection of the idea there can be any kind of Platonic ideal of Baltic religion, which I think has held this field back to some extent, that it's been focused very much on the idea that a single Baltic religion can be reconstructed. And once we set aside and let go of that idea and embrace the complexity of what's going on, not only in the complexity of perhaps multiple different strands of pagan religion, but also multiple forms of syncretism that are operating simultaneously, that complexity will allow us to actually move forward in understanding the society of late medieval and early modern Lithuania and other Baltic nations. Yes, I mean, I regret now, really, having had this wonderful response from Dr. Ķencis, that there isn't more on Livonia and there isn't more on Latvia in the book, and that perhaps is something which I hope other scholars may be able to correct. Yeah, the focus is primarily on Lithuania, partly because most of the Latin sources were produced in the context of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And as you say, there was this strict political demarcation at the time between Livonia and Lithuania. But I don't want to waste any more time, so it would be great to open up to some questions that people may have from the floor.
Thanks, Francis. And the first questions are already appearing in the Q&A. So I'd like to invite the rest of the audience to to either raise their hands, turn on their cameras, and put the question live, or use the Q&A down below and type your question. Well, perhaps before we'll address the first one, I'd like to open the Q&A session with something of a bit less serious matter. Francis, tell us which text or which body of text or which text in particular was either the most interesting for you or the most difficult to translate or to deal with.
Well, yeah, the most interesting to me, the one which actually began the book and that I most wanted to present to the public in an English translation, was Jan Wozicki's De Diis Samogitarum, on the gods of the Samogitians, which is the longest text that is exclusively devoted to Baltic pagan religion, and is available in Lithuanian in a wonderful translation and edition by Professor Ališauskas. But when I was preparing that translation, I felt that it would not be fair to simply present that on its own, because Baltic religions are so little known in the English-speaking world. It needed the context of the other texts to go with it. But that was, if you like, the central plank, that text really of the whole collection.
Okay, thanks. So we are already having three comments or questions. So the first one by Egle Braukaite, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly. So I'll read it out loud. Dr. Francis has mentioned this persistent polemic context in which paganism is discussed or even defined. Do any of the panelists recognize any new constraints and biases when discussing paganism in our contemporary times? Is Baltic paganism now free of the hegemonic Christian bias? Or are there any new biases available when defining it or talking about it? So I'll just read again the question. Is Baltic paganism now free of the hegemonic Christian bias? Or are there any new biases available when defining or talking about it? So perhaps I think, Francis, you could start.
Yes, I think that probably the hegemonic Christian bias is something which isn't a major factor now in the interpretation of Baltic religions. I think perhaps a much greater presence that looms over the interpretation of Baltic religions is the national revivals of the 19th century and their particular constructions of or imaginings of what Baltic religion was or should be. And I think another factor is that there are people in contemporary Latvia and Lithuania who identify with paganism, so contemporary pagan reconstructionists, and they can be quite culturally influential and culturally visible, and therefore it can be easy to make an assumption that they represent a tradition continuing from prehistory or from the Middle Ages and so forth. And of course, it's much more complex than that, and they are, to a large extent, new religious movements. And therefore, that can give a context which can lead to slightly, a slight twisting of interpretation. And therefore, I think it's important not only to let go of any kind of Christian hegemonic interpretation, but also to let go of the interpretations of the national revivals, and to let go as far as possible of any influence that there might be of what we see today from people who might identify with those pagan traditions.
Dr. Ķencis or Professor Ališauskas, would you like to add anything? Please, just shortly. Dr. Ķencis.
Yes, I here agree totally with Francis, and that is also the reason why I wouldn't use the word paganism today at all. I'd say neo-paganism. And this neo-paganism then will include those new religious practices that kind of construct reference to some pre-Christian times, because the term paganism, it's itself, as there is also will be in introduction of the book, it's highly constructed. It's made in this Christian context, and you use it or with or without it, there will be this history, anti-Christianity. And therefore, for example, for research purposes, I think it's much better to use terms like vernacular religion, which doesn't define it in doctrinal terms as Christian, pagan, or something, but that define it as a local practice that may include different faiths and different standings. Thank you.
Okay, as the time flies, I would go for the next question or comment, which is by Darius Mereckis. So, Mr. Mereckis, if you could perhaps turn on your camera. And,
okay, where can I do it? I'm trying to. I don't see how can I do it, but you can hear me, right?
We can hear you. Please go ahead.
So maybe I will just speak without you seeing me. So hello, Francis. I really enjoy following you on Twitter. Nice to see you. Thank you very much for your book. It's really a great book. I'm enjoying reading it very much, and our discussions on Twitter as well. And thanks for appearing at this chat. So my question would be, you mentioned that the argument by Baroness and Ravel, who argued that the conversion of Lithuania in 1387 was sort of already a fact because of the decay of Lithuanian pagan religion.
We don't hear you. We can't hear you. Could you perhaps either try to
I was muted again. I don't know why. Okay, so I mentioned I want to ask about the argument that is presented by Baroness and Ravel that since Lithuanian pagan religion was decayed by 1387, the choice was essentially between the Orthodox and Catholic worlds. Is this something that you think that the text that you have selected entire this book are addressing? Because some texts are actually mentioned, Ruthenia and Orthodoxy, but do they at all are concerned with this choice? Do they try to portray it as sort of a Lithuania's Western direction, springing from the natural Latin pagan roots and coming into the Western world, or this is just as you say, just a preference of individual Grand Dukes' lifestyles?
Thank you, Darius, for your question. That's it's a really interesting issue that you raise. Baroness and Roll, as you've mentioned, they argue essentially that the Lithuanian national cult, or the Grand Ducal cult, if you like, was almost a confected or constructed counterpoint to Christianity, which was there almost to fill that void left by the absence of a monotheistic religion, because the Grand Dukes up to Jogaila did not want to tie their colors to one of the great monotheistic religions. That may well be true. I think what is clear, though, is that well, as Professor Ališauskas has emphasized, there were multiple religions, multiple ways within that Baltic pre-Christian religion in Lithuania. And certainly there seems to have been a distinction between the cult that was worshipped by the Grand Dukes and the religion that people in ordinary Lithuanians, Samogitians, may have been pursuing. And certainly the suggestion that I make in the introduction to the book, is that when it comes to that ordinary people's religion, it may well be that it had more in common with the kind of folk religion that we find elsewhere in East Central Europe, or even further afield, even in Western Europe and in Britain, than in fact it was alien. So certainly in the worship or the belief in spirits connected with woods and hills and the countryside, that's something which we find throughout Europe. And perhaps we shouldn't see Baltic religion in that sense as being as alien as it might first appear when we apply this pagan word to describe it. But when it comes to the cult of the Grand Dukes, it seems to have been linked with, worship of Pekunas as thunder god, as supreme deity. And it may well be, although there isn't really any direct evidence for this, but it may well be that already before the official conversion, there was some attempt at classicism or some awareness that perhaps this could be presented in a Roman way. We certainly know that the court of the Grand Dukes used Byzantine court ceremonials. So they were, in a sense, quite self-consciously engaging in Romanitas, in Romanness. And it may well be that already before that conversion event, there is some kind of hint of their constructing their religion in Roman terms. But the truth is, we just don't know really enough about what the Grand Dukes were doing, what kind of cult they were following in that court religion. So really the texts in the book can only speak properly to that folk religion, to that kind of popular religion that was taking place in the Lithuanian countryside. But it's a fascinating question.
Good, thanks. I think there is still a space for one last question, which is already provided in the Q&A. And if you could, Francis, perhaps just address just a very short answer, and then we can wrap everything up. So I'll read the question aloud again. So, do Latin and German authors seems to be inserting ideas from classical Mediterranean religion or the medieval Christian perception of that into Baltic religions where they might distort our understanding?
Yes, I think that's very likely. The idea that authors are engaging in this process of interpretatio Romana, where they are interpreting Baltic religions through the lens of Greco-Roman religion, which of course are the form of paganism that most educated people in Western Europe would have been very familiar with. So yes, absolutely. And certainly when you look at the visual representation of Baltic religion, portrayals from the 16th and 17th century of what a pagan priest or what a pagan sacrifice might look like, they are very, very classically influenced. They've got these rectangular altars with fires burning on them. The significance of snakes, it's possible that the heavy interpretation of that as being linked to the cult of Asclepius, the god of health, the god of medicine, that is something which affects the way in which people are interpreting that. So yeah, I think that's very likely, and it's one of the things that makes this field quite challenging, and it's something which interpreters of Baltic religions have got to be on the lookout for always.
Thanks, fantastic. So I think we have addressed all the questions. By the way, there was one very praising comment in the chat on YouTube. But as there is already 1 o'clock and a few minutes, we should end at this point. So, well, it's my great pleasure that I could host this event, and I think we should all thank for hosting the event. Our gratitude goes to the Embassy of Lithuania here in London, to His Excellency the Ambassador and the whole team of the embassy. And and not only me, but basically Professor Ališauskas and Dr. Ķencis and the others think that this book will be really a valuable contribution to the scholarly research of both the ancient or pre-Christian paganism medieval studies and Central/Eastern European studies, not mentioning the history of religion perspective. So I would now give you, Francis, a space at the end. If there is something extra special you would like to address, and then we would close. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all those who've contributed questions, really interesting questions coming from the audience. And thank you again to all of the participants, and to you, Pavel, especially for hosting today. And thank you again to Ambassador Norkus, to the staff of the Lithuanian Embassy, who I know have put in a lot of effort into organizing this at a time that's been very busy for the embassy. So thank you so much, everyone, for participating.